Since the dawn of video games, we have had various formats to get our games on, be it the grandpa of physical media, the cartridges, commonly found in old Nintendo consoles. Eventually, as time moved on, these transferred to CDs, and in turn, as is normal, this evolved into the DVDs, and now potentially reaching the evolutionary peak with the commonly used Blu-ray disc, or if you're Nintendo, it's a glorified SD card. Effectively, still a cartridge, because evolution doesn't matter, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But as the world has become more and more plugged into as internet access, like a plague swept over the world, although the main plague it brings about these days is X, formerly known as Twitter, the internet has become much easier to access for the general consumer, even in the last decade, as government and service providers have been attempting to roll out those fiber optic speeds into much more rural areas. So therefore much more availability, which obviously led to a growth in digital marketplaces, with Steam now being the biggest for PC, to the point where physical games for PC are all but extinct. Even having a disk drive in your PC is like seeing a floppy disk outside of the word save icon. And of course, all of the main consoles, PlayStation, Xbox, even Nintendo, acknowledge the 21st century. Pigs do fly. They've all got their own individual stores, and yes, Nintendo and Sony to a degree have significant issues with shovelware across the board, because Nintendo's seal of approval means nothing anymore. Life is a lie. The benefit of this is we can still buy and download these games straight onto our device, with the ability to increase the storage with extra SSD options for PlayStation and Xbox. And Switch, you could buy extra storage SD cards. To be fair, this doesn't just help the digitals only, though, because you need that storage space for physical games as well, as God forbid the game comes on a disc entirely. That would be so 2000s. Admittingly, these stores do have some downsides, as most consoles only have the proprietary store on there. It effectively means it's a monopoly, which actually has led to various different lawsuits. And if something similar happens, like the Apple case, where they have been forced to allow other app stores or ways to install apps onto iPhones, particularly within the EU, and you'll notice the EU are the ones that seem to find a lot of corners when it comes to tech. So there is a chance that the console manufacturers might be forced to implement something similar. This is a growing problem that gamers and developers are slowly getting annoyed by. Yet again, there is multiple options on PC, and most people just use Steam or CD keys because we poor. So unlike the early days of digital storefronts, we can see some particularly high prices basically still being launch price several years after release, meaning physical can still actually be largely cheaper, aside from maybe some very hyper-specific games like the Deadpool game, which is only available on physical, or maybe even something more retro, you know. Anything Nintendo basically retains its value, to be honest. While this generation has given more support for an all-digital future, that doesn't mean the console providers haven't given some benefits to us physical gamers. Xbox have a significant backwards compatibility feature, meaning a major portion of games from their older systems can actually be played natively just by popping in a disc, often with improved frame rates and stability fixes. Although I don't think even this would probably make Sonic 06 playable. But you know, you couldn't do so much when you're polishing a turd. Don't question it. We got to the door somehow by I don't know how I did that. I somehow. Oh shit. I think we're completely broken, chap. Sony as well have backwards compatibility with PS4 games. To be fair, I'd like more from them, but the PS3 is a nightmare at the best of times because of the architecture that they chose to implement. So I do understand that there is difficulties there now. But at least we can still download select PS1 and PS2 games through the PS Plus Premium selection. Now, it could have a better solution, but I'll take it if I can play Parappa the Rapper 2. Just let me play it in peace. And of course, the Nintendo Switch 2 is confirmed backwards compatible as well. And Nintendo Switch Online has a selection of Nintendo's library, basically almost all of it, all the way from the original Nintendo launch to the SNES, to the 64, and the GameCube coming up for the Switch 2. So, while there's not a complete library, they have done quite a lot in allowing us to play them. But Nintendo always did, but I think I'd still prefer being able to buy them. Like, you know, the Wii U. Except, you know, who bought a Wii U? With the Switch 2 being backwards compatible, that does also rely on physical media. Even if many will be some kind of game key card thing, you still have to physically put that into the console. And quite frankly, these game keys, they make me feel like the world's worst secret agent. But Xbox still has the Series S, the less powerful brother to the Series X that has no disk drive, which honestly gives me the vibes of, you know when you give the spare controller to your sibling and you don't plug it in? Yeah, that. And Sony also has their digital console. And then the slim digital console with a disk drive attachment, which then started a trend as the Pro came out and the Standard didn't have a disk drive. But it did allow for the attachment for the low, low price of $69.99. Nice. And this is where I find it gets interesting, because it almost feels like we're being charged add-on content just to play the games. And I have to admit, it feels like they're testing the waters on how we will feel about a disk drive attachment as standard for the PS6. Or at the very least, how well it sells overall to gauge interest. But after the PS5 Pro, I'm thinking more and more that we'll be seeing the same approach. Basically, one model with a choice of an attachment, which will then inevitably be scalped to all hell. Do I like this fact? No, not really. I'd still rather have a disk drive built in as an option, as I make no allusion to the fact that I'm way more invested in physical media. And I feel that an extra £100 to have a disk drive just feels like a lot to ask of me when I'm already be committing several £100 to the console in the first place. And yes, I know at the moment it's about 70 quid, but by the time the PS6 comes out, I must guarantee to you it's going to be at least 100 quid add-on. Guarantee to you. Although, I guess the cost would kind of be incorporated into the main console anyway. But I'm sure there's bound to be more of a markup by getting it not fitted. Sure of it. This is just late-stage capitalism we are on about. Of course there'll be a markup, of course. Although, from a business sense, I kind of understand might be their way to recoup more of the initial console development cost, which is sad for us as it'd be a higher cost up front, and traditionally they have almost always sold their consoles at a loss and relied on game sales to make up that difference. But this might be where that changeover is going to happen. Another factor that I think will keep consoles from going fully digital yet, despite the growing number of people who have access to the internet and at good speeds, has significantly increased. But there is still this elephant in the room: internet poverty. It's a strange thing to think of around gaming, but bear with me, as I think this will affect it more than we realize. It's effectively internet poverty, the access to the internet at a decent price, a decent speed, and a decent quantity. And surprisingly, there are still many places in the world that don't have access to internet. Now, there are a lot of developing countries involved in this, but there's also prevalent in more developed countries, particularly among rural communities. Now, I know from my experience as a teenager all the way up till 2020, my family home had effectively dial-up connection speeds. Get off the phone! I'm trying to use the internet! And that never properly worked either, to a point where I actually had one of those phone things, like a pocket Wi-Fi, that you put in the window to get 4G internet, do my homework, but it was painfully slow and often didn't work. So I'd often go to a friend's house or use public Wi-Fi in like a coffee shop or the local Wetherspoons. I was definitely only drinking Coke, Your Honor. And I'd use that to download content and such to keep me entertained. To be fair, I also spent a lot of money on DVDs. So it actually probably made me more attached to physical media. as I didn't have an alternative until very recently. I think my Netflix account was actually started in 2019 when I was in university. But obviously all this changed for me when the pandemic hit. I was in university, I couldn't use Zoom or such anything really because the connection was too poor. Downloading video games would have been near impossible. Look, I've moved out since then. And my parents' internet was actually sorted by their service provider during the latter part of 2020. And I can now happily report they can now watch Netflix in 2 separate rooms. Free, it might slow down to a crawl and you might find a snail overtaking it. We take what we can get. And I guess that's the price of being in a rural setting. Less people, so the cost to install fiber cabling is much higher and not worth the returns of big companies. But we get a banging view. And while I know many countries have tried to support bringing their Wi-Fi to more rural settings, the UK government is actively trying to roll this out as I speak. And I'll admit, we were in a fortunate enough position that we were able to actually afford the internet. It was just the concept of getting the thing to the house at a speed that was capable of doing anything of value that was our main issue. There were actually studies during the COVID outbreak that pointed out that school from home faced these issues with kids not having reliable internet, with numbers scarily high. It was actually dubbed a digital divide. But taken away the availability, there are still people who are struggling to afford decent speed internet, especially as the cost of living is continuously rising. And the internet has become less of a luxury in recent years, and it's now more of a necessity compared to how it was 10 years ago. So let's bring this back to gaming, you know, that thing. Video games are, at the heart of it, yes, a luxury item, but many people will save for some considerable time to get a game console, and it might be their main form of entertainment and for them to unwind. So having to have the potential extra expense of decent internet so they can download games, which can now exceed 50 gigabytes of data regularly, or if you're Call of Duty, just how? You're a game that you shoot things in. How many guns are there? How is it possible? 100-hour RPGs have a smaller file size than you. Look, and these file sizes might just push more people away. And I believe the companies know this. I think looking more long-term, potentially for the PS7 and the Xbox 720p X equals Y or whatever stupid thing they call it next time, they will be more likely to be all digital. But we still have at least one generation left with physical still prominently there. And limited run games and super rare games are helping keep that fight going. But the generation after would likely have those optional disk drives as standard probably. And I still think that the next generation with the PS6 though, I think they might still veer on that disk drive as standard. And then for subsequent models, they will go down the disk drive attachment route. At least I hope so. But they've made weirder choices before. Now, game sales are probably one of the major factors that companies will look at when they have to make a decision about physical's place in the next generation. The PS5, for most of 2023, the percentage of physical sales were 41%, and in 2024, it had dropped to 32%. But even more in depth, only 19% of game sales on Xbox were physical, which kind of makes sense as Xbox has fully embraced this digital future, and of course, Game Pass in general. Now, does this take into account subscription services and the second-hand market? I don't know. I imagine the second-hand game market is much harder to track, and of course, game companies don't make a direct profit from that. But counterpoint, if they do make a sequel and the game did well second-hand, they'd likely sell more copies straight up for the sequel. But companies like trackable data and spreadsheets and in-office work. So can we really trust them to make good choices? But I feel it's right to add into the discussion that the physical game market is less prominent on the high street than it's ever been before in gaming history. So the impulse buys are less frequent. In the UK, leading game retailer with the most creative name in history, Game, no longer sells second-hand games and even struggles to have new releases in. In fact, it's basically a glorified Lego and plushie shop at this point. Okay, so we've got sports shop, where you buy your sports things and your sports stuff. Game shop, but it's not a game shop. They've got your toys, you've got your toys, you've got your Lego, you've got more Lego. But this is Mario Lego, so kind of game, but not quite game. We've got these accessories, because you need accessories, and your special massager that's going to be very useful for your flexing your game muscles after you played that good game of League of Legends. Right, you come over here, you can buy yourself a gaming chair because you can do that. Or you know what, you'll find me some game stuff again, Kirby thing, and the smallest selection of games you can imagine. But don't worry, half of them are out of stock. And as time has gone on, other stores from supermarkets, all of which used to stock video games, as well as retailers like WH Smith's, which for those of you who are unaware is a bookseller and stationery shop in the UK. So yeah, they were very available during previous generations. That is my genuine dad's copy of Resident Evil 2 that I found. I don't understand it either. So now really the only way to get physical games is now Amazon, which is probably just as convenient as a digital download. In fact, less so, because at least with a digital download, I can play it as soon as it downloads, probably the same day, instead of waiting for a vague time the next day from 3 till 6 that will constantly change to be 4 till 7 or 7 till 10, and then it'll get potentially posted through the wrong letterbox, and yes, it's happened to me way more than once at this point. I'm calm. I'm very calm. Although it's a small price to pay, particularly with a backlog as deep as mine is, so it's not too bad. I can buy things a lot more secondhand because I just want to get through my backlog. Although I will say this, please try and support your local game stores if you can. There are only a small number of independents left, but they have honestly all been fantastic to me over the years. Every single one I've gone into. Most now are having to veer off into selling various different figures or specialized stuff. And in fact, I went to one recently that had several layers of games, but at the same time, they had Lego on offer in a small section of the back, and they did certain tabletop stuff in there as well. And that was them having to diversify with the times, which in fairness, there was still plenty more games there than Game had, so I'll take it. Now, despite the limitations of physical media, we're actually seeing a significant percentage of people going against this trend and sticking to physical media. And I'd be interested to see the data on physical game sales this year compared to last. Because last year we saw a lot of streaming services remove content that was digital only from films and TV shows, effectively leaving no way for us to experience that show or film ever again. Unless, you know, you pirate it. I'm not naming any names about the companies. Disney. Did anyone hear that? I think the wind. I think it was the wind. Now, this could lead to that number skyrocketing even further, even with companies like GOG attempting to help game preservation. But look, they can only do so much. I guess in reality, you could probably refer to this as a loss of trust in the various different companies that have allowed this to happen. How are we going to trust them to allow us to keep access to this media? And considering the fact that if you look at the estimates, video games that have been released ever, 87% are unplayable without piracy. With all that, I believe there is more of a growing skepticism around a digital-only future, as games can be removed without any real warning and without any physical presence. There would be no way for them to play that game ever again, at least legally. A great example of this is the Deadpool game, which after the last movie came out, skyrocketed further in value. Because of various different license issues, it was delisted on all platforms several years ago. I actually have a copy. It cost me about £20 a few years ago. And now it's going for nearly 60 on PS4. It peaked near a 90 when the last movie dropped. But other consoles did have it for cheaper. I'll admit that. Other consoles did have it for cheaper. But if that was a digital-only release, let's just imagine that world. Like the Scott Pilgrim game was for years and years and years. It would be gone forever. Referenced in Kotaku articles of games you can no longer play but wish we saw again. And if we ever did see it again, like the Scott Pilgrim game happened, we would be over the moon. But there's no guarantee. And the fact is that we now know after the Concorde disaster that they can just remove games without our consent if it's connected to the internet. So even if we have a game downloaded, there's no guarantee we won't lose it forever. Remember PT? We'd never have a situation like that ever again. I mean, considering people tried to sell their consoles for more because it was on there? I mean, people will do anything to get that back, I swear, but still. And if you consider all of these factors, the apprehension is likely going to grow. And it's kind of hard to judge from the PS5 Pro launch because of scalpers, but the PS5 disk drive is selling. And around 80% of PS5 sales are for the disk drive version. So consumers are definitely happy about having the choice there. And I really don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. Blockbuster, Betamax, and VHS, all things that most people are way too young to even know existed. Anyway, all of those were eventually put in a position where they became obsolete. Blockbuster was replaced by Netflix, Betamax was beat by VHS, and VHS was beat by DVDs, and then DVDs were put inside a £1 section at CEX to run away in effectively a DVD retirement home where you barely get any visits and maybe occasionally someone will take you out. Netflix may have revitalized the home entertainment industry with the massive selection and variety at a low cost. I know, not so much now, but they've locked us in now. How would we cope without being able to watch Squid Game or sat on the toilet? And to be fair, for years, games weren't able to capitalize on this media style, and physical games lived in harmony with their steep digital releases and brick-and-mortar stores. Then this all changed when Game Pass attacked. And suddenly, with Xbox's $1 first month subscription and significant library, and the killer app of the situation. Day one releases. And look, I have opinions on day one releases, but regardless, for gamers, it is a money-saving situation. And an amazing way to bring us in. And well, instead of paying £60 for a game, we are getting a whole library for less than the price of a takeaway. And for gamers who maybe like a little bit of variety, this is kind of perfect, as we can see so many different genres, from simulation games, FPS games, role-playing games, Eroge games. Maybe not that last one, but the options are all there. Now, Game Pass might be viewed as the more popular option, but statistically, there is a higher install base in the 40 millions for PS Plus, but only around 30% of those are actually paying for the higher tiers, with PS Plus Premium and PS Plus Extra, as opposed to Game Pass, which has around 20 million active subscribers. But PS Plus Premium has done it slightly differently and has a bit more of a niche to it, and how it's handled older games, with a primary focus on PS1 and PS2 games, which Sony, in fairness, do have the luxury of because of their extensive back catalogues of IPs and games, which they often like to forget. But as fans, for nostalgia, it's great, and nostalgia sells, we all know that. These significant numbers show there is a level of convenience there, and admittingly, I pay for both. And there are games I check out there, and as I browse through their selection. So as the install base increases, it's such a small price to pay to experience all of these games. And while I think, just like how Netflix created the streaming phenomenon, the thing is with it, DVDs and Blu-rays haven't actually gone away. In fact, last year, the demand increased. But these streaming services will have an effect on sales, particularly if day one releases are included, as a lot of gamers who might have bought it will just play it on the streaming service they already pay for. So I think from a developer's point of view, the best approach is to be added several months later, and therefore help expand the reach, and then this might increase the appeal for a sequel. And therefore more sales later down the line, the cycle repeats itself, etc, etc, etc. Although if you're an indie game, these services are probably much more beneficial as it gets your game seen by a bigger audience. But certainly for the more double and triple A releases, day one releases seems counterproductive. Changing tact a little bit here, while Nintendo do like to live on their own little island, no, not an Animal Crossing island, that would be stupid. Why would Nintendo acknowledge Animal Crossing like that? This isn't 2020. So they're not really the best benchmark for a new generation, but it would be slightly foolish to not at least discuss it, as they are releasing a console this year, and they're likely the only major launch we will see before a next generation. So there might be some signs of things to come from how they approach it. Namely, Nintendo is going for the dartboard and Mystic Meg approach to their pricing, but apparently if you ask them, they deny that, and they say that they have a little more thought in their pricing than we would be believed at first. In reality, they're going for a variable pricing structure, a far cry from the last 20 years or so of gaming, where it was generally 60 for a AAA release, 40-ish for a AA release, and then indie products were largely less and, you know, a little bit more hit and miss of what kind of price range. Now, Nintendo claim they'll be looking at a variety of different factors when it comes to their price structure, from development time, depth of gameplay, even repeatability. I'm not entirely sure how each one will affect the price individually, but for the moment, we do know that digital games will cost less than their physical counterpart, with Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza being priced at $66.99 and $58.99 respectively here in the UK, with the physical costing £8 more. Almost a return to that 360 and PS3 time, where digital distribution was generally cheaper than physical, as physical obviously has to print the game, they've got to transport the cards to stores and such. So physical being a bit more expensive, while I don't like it, does make sense, at least from a logistical point of view. Obviously, the prices are still subject to change in America, with tariffs already postponing the Switch 2's pre-order date, which has now happened, but the caveat is the price can change at any time, as the situation potentially changes, which might still be likely as the year creeps on. Now, all of this together doesn't sound awful, but across the world, the price of physical games being more expensive can negatively impact those sales. There will be people like myself who would still rather buy their games physical, and they'll stay that way, clinging on to physical like a monkey paw we use to keep them releasing physical games. Sometimes you wonder if the wish was worth it, don't you? But now, with the cost of living rising, if you have to choose between that extra price or the digital version, then the digital version wins out, particularly if that game is something that you're desperate to play right now. And particularly if this tariff situation heats up again, the American audience for those physical games will receive a bigger hit, as the prices for those games will increase, as most physical cards are made in Japan, and the packaging is often made in other countries, like China. So the price of these will obviously increase. But the digital versions, it's unlikely to be affected, as, well, they live in the cloud and servers somewhere, probably. You can't put a tariff on a cloud, surely. Right? Is Cloud City from Star Wars getting tariffs now? Now, the main point of bringing this up is the Switch 2 is kind of next gen. I know it's confusing, but stay with me. If the Switch 2 is going to approach it this way, this might be the way we see Xbox and Sony approach it next, which makes market sense. But the sad reality is, the tariff affects prices any more for the Americans, then the risk is the demand for physical games will drop faster than they already are. And if that happens, there's a chance that the next gen could scrap physical releases altogether. Xbox have largely shuttered their production of physical games, doubling down on Game Pass and digital media. And if their profits are even more limited, then does it even make financial sense to continue making physical games? Particularly in markets like America, which is arguably one of the biggest territories. Although Sony and Nintendo do still benefit from having a massive audience base in Japan, which is still a massive physical buying country. So that means they'll still do it, but maybe ship less copies, effectively having it as a shorter term premium product, or even partner more with companies like Limited Run and Super Rare Games. But realistically, this situation may just cause the demand to drop further. And I see at least Xbox ditching physical entirely for their next release. So despite a growing digital library for the vast majority of gamers, I think as long as there's demand for some physical games, they will remain. And Nintendo, look, they're firmly sticking with the physical library, even with this kind of weird game key thing. So I imagine if disk drive sales are up, the companies will happily take our money. So at the very least, we will have an add-on disk drive for the next generation on PlayStation. I do think Xbox might do their own thing, as they have very little physical presence as it is, and mainly relying on digital and Game Pass. So I think it's going to be Nintendo that will stick with the largest physical presence of the three from the off. Sony, they're going to stick to that mix approach, built around this add-on potentially. And then Xbox, they're going to be fully diskless. But it's still unknown how licenses will function to preserve these games. GOG are making strides, but they're still more difficult for games stuck on console. So that leaves a few questions there, which we won't get the answers to anytime soon. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down below. Did I miss anything? Is there anything you would like me to touch on more? In the meantime, though, please remember to like, subscribe, and go and check me out over on Twitch at @_untitledgamer. I'm live there 4 times a week, usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. All my links are below. But in the meantime, guys, have an absolutely good one.